we said at the top, it seems as though God has two different moods depending on the testament you're in. In the old, he's sort of angry and he's all about dominating and getting some land for some people, and there's judgment and there's wrath at times, and he tells his people to do some very graphic things. And then we get to the New Testament, and he seems to be very loving and caring, and he cares for his people, and we see all that personified in the person and the figure of Jesus. And yet, both are God. And so how do we reconcile what seems like two very different expressions of God, and yet they are the same to some degree?
Yeah, there's some ways to do this poorly. And there's some ways to at least kind of wade into it, I think, with some faith and some fear and some trepidation. Mm-hmm. First of all, in the Old Testament, we hear this command, which is echoed in the New Testament, that the Lord your God is one. Mm. It's the Shema in the original Hebrew context, and so God is one. So you can't say that was a different God over there. He woke up in a better mood that day,
right?
So there's this idea that God is one. There's also, I think, two of the attributes of God that come into play, which is God's holiness and God's love. And we talked about in the last episode of this that God met people where they were. He met people in the spot that they were, and he took them somewhere from that. The thing that you see in all of the Old Testament gods, and this may not be the most satisfying answer or perfect answer, and there's probably others who have better things to say about this than I do, is that they were all kind of vengeful. They all demanded sacrifice, and that was the way you kept them from being ticked off. But there was not this concept of faithfulness on the other side of failure.
Interesting.
And so really, what you were doing in sacrifice is you were buying off the deity. Mm-hmm. And there were some really terrible deities that, he'd sacrifice children to, and just horrible things that God found abhorrent. He talked about just how detestable that those things were and those gods were, and he commanded his people to stay really far away from them. And throughout the Old Testament, people just they gravitated over there again and again. And I think some of that was because of the culture that they surrounded themselves with. I'm not saying this is the greatest answer ever, mm-hmm. but I think there's a link not only to God's holiness, that God demanded a set apartness for his people, which was literal. Like when they take the promised land, there's a lot of fighting and killing. Mm-hmm. And so there's this literal idea of set apartness in the Old Covenant. And it framed really well, not only in the practical context they found themselves in, but in just their cultural understanding of what do we do as a people. And because of God's holiness, because of his set apartness, there's nothing that can be shared with that. And when that's worked out in the covenant community, there's this literal idea that nothing can be shared with it. These other religions, these other ideas that there's no way that can happen. But even there, you start to see the seeds of something different. You start to see the seeds of God doing things differently than all the other deities or all the other nation states around them did. And it's an interesting juxtaposition against like the setting in the Gospels or the setting in the New Testament letters, where here the Christians, the Jesus followers, are not the majority. They're set in an empire context, which is foreign, and a lot of Paul's writings, for instance, are like, don't do that, don't go over there.
Right.
The Romans do it this way, or the culture around you does it this way. Don't do that. But there's no swords, there's no killing, and like a great example of this is like when Peter, on the night Jesus is betrayed, and he goes to the garden, and he goes and he gets arrested. Peter whips out a sword. And he tries to start the revolution. And it's because that was the understanding of how things were. But Jesus had put an end to that. He hadn't put an end to the holiness of God, mm-hmm. because God is one, but he'd put an end to that being the way that you did the thing.
Oh, and back to the fulfillment, he's actually saying the way through power is actually submission.
Yeah.
And I'm going to personify that, and I'm going to demonstrate that now. In fact, put that away. And that's a really interesting point. I never thought about that. Even though the culture works in this way, and God worked through the culture at the time, when Jesus shows up and the fulfillment happens, he actually starts reversing or undoing some of the ways that they would have understood how to function.
Yeah, and this may or may not be relevant, but in the Old Testament, you have a people who were not a people and they become a people, and then they have this promised land, and then they have the working out of the original covenant, the old covenant, the ceremonial laws, the sacrificial system, just how you relate and you interact with God, which was in many ways, it was, like I said, it wasn't completely foreign to the other religious systems around them, but it was taking steps away from that, even at the very beginning. It was markedly different in those ways. Like the idea that God would be with the people or among the people or dwell in the presence of the people was profoundly different.
Yeah.
And even there, you start to see the kind of the outline or the shadow of what becomes fulfilled in the New Testament begin to emerge. You start to see it happen. And so then they go from being a people to being a nation, to then having a king, to then in various different ways, falling short or going their own way, or even rebelling against God, depending on when and which king you were talking about. Some kings who just kind of fell off the path, and there were a handful of them were just like they were detestable,
right,
in God's sight in terms of what they did. To then the kind of the comeuppance for that, the things that God had said, if you do this and you stay faithful, this will happen. But if you don't, these other things will happen. And so they end up in exile. They end up as scattered people. There's some blips kind of on the radar, like in Ezra and Nehemiah, where there's a restoration. But even there, like this being the end working out of what God was doing was not the case. You end the Old Testament in the book of Malachi with prophecy, and then you have 400 years of silence. And so it seems like God kind of wasn't there, but God was always there. And then it's one of my favorite parts of the scriptures. There's kind of this turn out of that. Where is God? Is God even still here? Was he ever there? You see that in the beginnings of the Gospels. One of the things that I think people miss in the narrative of Jesus being born in Luke 2 and in Matthew is that like everybody was just waiting for this, and then they're like, here it is. A lot of people weren't. A lot of people had given up, and really that whole idea that the Messiah was actually going to come was like there's a handful of old people like Simeon that you see.
Right.
Most people like, they're there.
It was almost like this urban legend of like, yeah, we know the story, but I got taxes to pay and I got a job to do and I've got a life to live. That would be a nice thought, but I still have to function.
Yeah, and you have to function in the shadow and the backdrop of the Roman Empire. And so in the Roman Empire, like nobody won against the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Like, if you were a movement or if you were a rebellion or a revolution, like you just get crushed. And so there's even this parallelism between the people of ancient Israel, the Jewish people who kind of came together, came out of Egypt, wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, crossed the Jordan, entered the promised land, and then began to have to take the land. It wasn't just like they wandered in and God's like, here you go. This idea, and we talk about this in our series on Joshua, that the promised land was, it says it's a land flowing with milk and honey. There's this promise that's given much earlier about what the promised land will be, but it was also crawling with people who wanted to kill them.
Yeah.
And very strong nations, and just a lot of fighting was involved. And there's certainly a principle you can draw out of that. But there's still this idea that there's this not powerful group of people, but whom God is with. And when they're faithful, like you see this one in the Battle of Jericho, you see, and there's this other parallel battle in kind of a smaller, weaker place called Ai that happens right after it. When they're faithful and they follow God in the ways that he has told them to, which seem absolutely counterintuitive, it's not the way you would do it. You wouldn't march around the city 7 times. You'd like try to get enough people and try to go fight.
Yeah.
And they get kind of cocky as a result of it. And they're like, we got this. Here's this other little city. We're just going to go knock it over. And because they're unfaithful, because there's this unfaithfulness that happens in between in the camp, it doesn't work out.
Right.
But there is that idea again of faithfulness, then unfaithfulness, there's consequences. But there's also this idea of a people who has a low amount of power surrounded by a lot of power that's against them. And you carry that into the New Testament and suddenly it fits.
Right.
Because it's always the case that God is with the people who don't have the power, and he is the power. He is the source. He is among. And when the people kind of get like a little high on their own success, there's something that happens. And so you see that from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and you see that for the people of God in the present age. When we're like, we need the power, so we're going to go align with the people who have the power, and we'll even, we'll compromise with the people who have the power so we can have the power. God says, nope, not how it works. That's that warning that 1 Corinthians 10 talks about, that there's this thing that people always do. They did it back then, they did it in the middle, and they're tempted to do it here. And if you'll stay faithful to me, even though it means you won't get to do it like the people around you, because I'm not doing it like the people around you. I'm not doing it like the religious systems around you. I'm not doing it like, the ancient cult, the idol cults, or, the Greek and the Roman deities, or whatever in our present day represents power. It might not be overt religion at this point, but there's some things that act like religions in our present day.
Yeah.
And so a through line is my word with this, but that's what you see from the beginning to the end. And so it's seeing how God brings it to fulfillment. He brings it to fulfillment in Christ. And because Christ, is the righteousness that we stand on. It's not our abilities, it's not our accomplishments. It's not because we had anything to offer, but it's because God gave that, he imputed that to us in Christ. Suddenly now we can live in a completely different way, and we ought to. And when we're tempted to pick up the sword, we've missed what Christ has brought us.